Hi. In part three, I want to continue to share information and insights into the Gospel according to John and its relationship with the other Gospels. As I've noted, it was the last of the Gospels to be produced. Scholars believe it came to be written around 90 or maybe a little later AD, which makes it highly unlikely that it was written by someone who personally knew Jesus. And in fact, there are other cues that that's not the case, that this was not written by a disciple named John who had traveled with Jesus in those early days. Now, some people think that a person who is cited in the gospel on a number of occasions, a man known as the beloved disciple, was in fact John, and that this John was the author. Well, the beloved disciple was probably the disciple John, but that this was also the author of the book seems very unlikely, simply because they would have, or he would have identified himself if that were the case. He would have said, "That was me, I was there, I heard Jesus say this." That is not what happened. It appears that this came secondhand, that this information was imparted to, quite possibly, John the disciples' disciples, to people who followed him in the years after Jesus' ministry. But it's unlikely that these people were Jews like the original John. We get that cue from the fact that very often in the gospel, Jesus' enemies and critics are simply referred to as, quote, the Jews. Now, we tend to read that as the Pharisees, or at least the Pharisees who were opposed to Jesus, and that would be an accurate reading. But simply calling his opponents the Jews takes it to another level, and one which has had tragic consequences. Remember that Jesus' followers were Jews. Jesus himself was a Jew. To simply say the Jews opposed him was not very accurate, nor was it fair to the Jewish people. And it would seem very unlikely that a Jew would write it that way. Consequently, this book seems to have been written at a time when the relationship between the Jews and Christians had gotten more and more alienated and hostile, and that was taking place by the end of the first century. And that the bulk of the church by this time itself was Gentile and reaching out beyond its Jewish roots. So it seems that this book was directed to, as well as being written by, people with a Gentile background who came from Greek and Roman faiths and cultures before becoming Christian. And those cultures were also rather hostile toward the Jews. They had a relationship that was sometimes violent and other times just tense and uncomfortable. This made it a challenge for the early Christians to present a Jewish rabbi as not simply the Savior of Israel, not simply the Jewish Messiah, but the Savior of the world. And so they had to present Jesus in a very different way to an audience that wouldn't really appreciate the way the first three Gospels presented Jesus. One of the areas that would have been particularly problematic for them was something called the Messianic secret. In the first three Gospels, and most especially in the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of them, Jesus plays pretty coy when it comes to identifying himself as the Son of God, as the Messiah. He calls himself the Son of Man. And when other people try to call him the Son of God and the Messiah, he tells them to shut up, tells them to be quiet. He only cops to it at the very end when he is in being tried and has basically already been condemned to death and has nothing to lose for it. And the reason he waits until then is that making such a claim, claiming to be divine, claiming to be the Son of God, in Jewish culture was seen as actually wildly blasphemous. You didn't do that. That was claiming godhood for yourself, and God didn't share that with anybody as far as they were concerned. And for Jesus to make that claim too early would have gotten him stoned to death almost immediately. I think it likely that Jesus played coy, if you will, about being the Son of God until the very end. Just for that reason, he was avoiding an early death. He was avoiding being written off as crazed and demon possessed, because that would have been the likely response by most Jews. But here's the problem. In Gentile culture, there were lots of divine humans, lots of characters like Hercules and others who were part God, part human. They could understand that concept. That was very familiar to them, the idea of a God incarnate. And so the idea that Jesus would not make that claim was to them strange and incomprehensible. Consequently, in the Gospel according to John, Jesus is all the time saying that he is the Son of God, that he and the Father are one, that he is basically the incarnation of God on earth. A claim that probably would have gotten him instantly killed in Israel, but in the rest of the empire would have, well, it certainly would have sparked skepticism among a number of people, but it would have caught people's attention and they might have been curious enough to listen. So Jesus is presented in John in a different way that is comprehensible to a different audience, because the church is reaching beyond its Jewish roots. In fact, Jesus' whole style of teaching is very different. In the synoptic gospels, in the first three gospels, he tells these earthy, simple stories, parables. You find virtually none of that in John. Instead, he engages in kind of long philosophical monologues, which are more in line with what Greeks and Romans were used to from their philosophers and divine figures. Jesus makes his case that way. Long, involved, kind of looping dialogues and monologues with people. The gospel itself starts with a kind of meditation on Jesus' very nature as both human and divine. Mark starts out saying that Jesus is the Son of God, but then he marches right along and tries to make that case. With John, he goes into this really rather poetic reflection on what that means. His chronology is very different. He has Jesus showing up and cleansing the temple in Jerusalem very early in his ministry instead of right toward the end. He never actually depicts John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. They're in close proximity to one another. John endorses Jesus as the Messiah, but he's never actually depicted as baptizing Jesus, and that may be because by that point there was a cult that had risen up that actually proclaimed that John the Baptist was the Messiah instead of Jesus. And so the gospel authors of the Gospel of John may have gone, yeah, we don't want them getting too close. We don't want to make it seem like John is, endorsing Jesus as in a way that makes Jesus look somehow subordinate to him. That he needs Jesus, or rather John's endorsement. Meanwhile, another thing that's different about the Gospels is that there are really only two miracles that are shared in all four Gospels. They are the resurrection, and each Gospel has a somewhat differing account of the resurrection. We'll go into that another time. But the other one is the feeding of the multitudes, the thousands of people. The numbers vary a little bit from gospel to gospel, but they all agree that there was a moment in Galilee when Jesus fed thousands of people. Those are the only two miracles that all four gospels share. Almost none of the material you find in John is found in the other gospels. For instance, the resurrection of Lazarus only appears in John. The changing of water into wine only appears in John. These stories are picked because, for one reason or another, the author of John's Gospel, and it may be authors, it may have been a group effort, felt these stories would help convince people that Jesus was the incarnation of God and the Savior not just of Israel, but of the world. So John is written with a different audience in mind and presents Jesus in a very different way. That leads us with the question, how much of it is historically valid? Did Jesus really say these things? And there's no sure way to know. There's reason with some stories to say, well, there's some historical veracity there. There are reasons to believe that's a real historical event. Others may be sort of reflections on who Jesus is, with words that are put into Jesus' mouth that maybe he said, but we can't be entirely sure. Because once again, he's kind of avoiding calling himself the Son of God in the other three Gospels while owning up to it in the fourth. It's always been the challenge throughout history to present the gospel in a meaningful way to different cultures that have very different viewpoints. John does that in a way that has convinced many. And then they go on to read the other Gospels as well, and they get that picture of Jesus. It gets kind of complicated. There's no getting around that. But the truth comes through in different ways to different people. And that's why there are four Gospels. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to put something in the comments section. I'll be happy to answer what I can as best I can. I always tell people there are no such things as stupid questions. That's not entirely true, but there is such a thing as stupid answers, and I will do my best to avoid them. In the meantime, I hope this has been helpful, or at least thought-provoking, and that you will feel the presence of God wherever you are right now, because wherever you are, God is.